Hello and welcome to the online training on the 2019-2020 compliance component of the sponsor evaluation. In this online training, we will provide a detailed overview of the compliance component, which is comprised of all applicable laws and rules for community schools and community school sponsors. This online training will look at the individual item changes on both the sponsor and school level for the 2019-2020 review cycle. These changes to the list of all applicable laws and rules on the certification worksheets are based on updates to legislation as well as public feedback from education stakeholders. We will also review several examples using items from the certification worksheets to get a better understanding of how sponsor certification determination works. Next, we will review evidence submission, the validation review process, and expectations for the Onsite review for schools. In addition, we will discuss preliminary rating results and the adjustment review period. Lastly, we will discuss compliance calculations and scoring the publication of the final rating results. Let's start by reviewing compliance item changes from last year's review cycle to the sponsor evaluation for 2019-2020. Ohio Revised Code Chapter 3314 requires the department to evaluate compliance with all applicable laws and rules. Therefore, the list includes all laws and rules that apply to community schools as well as community school sponsors. There are two primary compliance files, Microsoft Excel spreadsheets, that are used for the 2019-2020 review, one of which is for sponsor items and one is for oversight of school items. The items remain numbered based on the category, with the items for all schools beginning with the 100s. Item numbers remain consistent. Items that were added due to changes in law or rule have been inserted at the end of the appropriate section and were assigned a new number. This allows the spreadsheet to be sorted by number and keep the categorization. As with previous years, there are one or more questions regarding the status or activities of the school or sponsor during the school year, which helps the sponsor to determine if the compliance item applies to them. These questions are also part of the certification determination process. It is imperative to make sure that you address every item and its component questions and answer accordingly to ensure you have a certification determination for each item. We will discuss this in more detail as we review examples of the component questions. So how many compliance items are on the worksheets for 2019-2020? For the review cycle, there are 23 sponsor-level compliance items included on the sponsor worksheet. 11 of the 23 sponsor-level items require sponsors to upload documentation to Epicenter. There are 282 school-level compliance items on the Oversight of Schools spreadsheet. However, 2 items are grayed out and are not included in the review. Therefore, the sponsor must only respond to a total of 280 school-level items. 78 of the 280 required school-level compliance items require sponsors to upload documentation to Epicenter. There are a few notes to point out regarding some of the sponsor-level items. Item S501 does not require a response from the sponsor and is grayed out. Reviewers will verify compliance for this item using the expenditure report submitted by sponsors to the department. Item S615 is an item that is calculated by the department based on a sponsor's percentage of compliance oversight of all schools in their portfolio. This item will be discussed later in the training in greater detail. In addition, there are a few school-level items to make note of for the 2019-2020 review cycle. Of the 282 items featured on the Oversight of Schools worksheet, there are 2 items that do not require a response from the sponsor. Item 121 does not require a response from the sponsor and is grayed out. Based on legislative updates, this item will be included in the 2020-2021 review cycle. 2 items, numbers 510 and 609, were removed from the spreadsheet. Item 780 does not require a response from the sponsor and is grayed out. Computer software has not yet been developed for this item. All specific compliance item changes to the worksheets are identified on the changelog, which are posted with the final worksheets on the department's website for the 2019-2020 evaluation tools. Item S102 was added to the sponsor worksheet for the 2019-2020 review cycle based on requirements in Ohio Revised Code. Both sponsor and school-level compliance items were updated, if applicable, to align dates with the current review cycle. One of the largest changes to the Oversight of Schools spreadsheet is the addition of several new compliance items. The inclusion of these items are based on statutory requirements from recently enacted legislation. Consequently, staff have updated the logic formulas behind the spreadsheets. These updates include the generation of the preliminary compliance determination as well as the auto-population of school and sponsor names when IRNs are entered. More specific details regarding the worksheets will be discussed in the next section on sponsor certification determination. Again, as a reminder, please access and review the published compliance change logs to identify specific changes. Resources for the 2019-2020 sponsor evaluation review cycle, such as the compliance worksheets, FAQs, the technical document, the quality practices rubric, change logs for both the compliance and quality instruments, and any corresponding guidance are available on the 2019-2020 Sponsor Evaluation Tools website. Note, per statutory requirements, once the final review instruments and change logs have been posted, no edits can be made to the documents. If issues arise or updates need to be communicated to sponsors, the FAQs will be updated and e-blasts will be sent out to sponsors. Now let's discuss certification determination. The worksheets containing the list of all laws and rules include additional columns that assist sponsors in certifying compliance with each item. As mentioned previously, each sponsor is required to submit one sponsor worksheet for the 23 sponsor-related compliance items and a separate Oversight of Schools worksheet for each sponsored school in their sponsor portfolio. Let's take a look at the various columns you will see on the compliance worksheets. There are 18 total columns on the Oversight of Schools worksheet and 16 total columns for the sponsor level worksheet. The first 10 columns on both spreadsheets reference the compliance number and the relevant citations for laws and rules from the Ohio Revised Code and/or Administrative Code for that specific item. The next 8 columns capture the component questions, compliance determination, and any additional documentation that may be required for submission in Epicenter to demonstrate compliance for that specific item. Where applicable, the certification process component questions have been split into 2 cells. For each listed question, there is a cell that will be used to answer the question with yes or no responses. The spreadsheets are designed to make it easier and more user-friendly. After a sponsor has responded to the listed component questions, the certification determination column will identify a sponsor's certification determination, and any required documentation will be displayed in the required documentation column. The last 2 columns are related to corrective action plans. These columns appear only in the Oversight of Schools file. They will not be used in the sponsor file. We will review the corrective action plan columns and how they function in questions in a few moments. The possible results in the certification determination column are sponsor certified compliant, sponsor certified compliant documentation required, sponsor certified not compliant, and sponsor certified not applicable. For component questions with more than one question for an item, be mindful that if your response to question 1 makes the second question not applicable, do not answer question 2. The certification determination result is based both on how you answered the questions for an item and if there is an associated required documentation for that compliance item. The determination will appear as soon as the questions have been answered. You either hit enter or move out of the cell to complete your response for that compliance item. The sponsor certified compliant and sponsor certified compliant documentation required determinations both indicate that you have certified you are compliant for the item. Now let's look at several examples you will come across as you complete your compliance worksheets. There are some items that have only one applicable question. Let's use item 171 on the Oversight of Schools spreadsheet as an example, which remains unchanged from the 2018-2019 review cycle. In this case, the columns for the second question set are grayed out, restricting you from entering a response. Compliance items may or may not require the sponsor to upload documentation to Epicenter. Please verify by cross-referencing the required documentation column for each compliance item. You will enter your response to the listed question. In this example, we have answered no, stating that the school does not have written policies and procedures regarding students with disabilities and does not ensure appropriate services are offered to those students as required by law. When you hit the enter button or move to a different cell, the certification determination is displayed based on the sponsor's response to question 1. In this case, the answer no means that you are certifying that the school is not compliant for this item. If the item is one that lists required documentation and the school is certified as not compliant for that item, you will need to provide a narrative of sponsor certified not compliant for the appropriate submission type in Epicenter. If the required documentation column indicates none, there is no need for additional action as there will be no submission types available in Epicenter for these items. In addition to the documentation requirement, if the certification determination is sponsor certified not compliant, a new question will be displayed in the Corrective Action Plan question column. Let's take a closer look at the Corrective Action Plan questions. If a school is not compliant for an item, but the sponsor has placed the school on a corrective action plan, the sponsor may be found to be compliant for that item. If the question is displayed, the sponsor must enter the applicable answer to the question in the Answer Regarding CAP column. In addition to answering the question, the sponsor must upload a copy of the corrective action plan for the school. Note: all corrective action plans will be submitted under one submission type in Epicenter rather than with the individual items. This is because a corrective action plan may be required even if there is no documentation requirement directly tied to that item in Epicenter. And just as a reminder, the corrective action plan columns only appear on the Oversight of Schools spreadsheet. These columns are not on the sponsor level compliance worksheet. Remember, you only need to respond if the certification determination result is sponsor certified not compliant. A corrective action plan should outline the steps necessary and the course of action needed to make a school compliant by the next review cycle. The corrective action plan must contain actionable steps and timelines to make the school compliant by the next cycle. The plan must also address the specific item for which the school is not compliant and a plan is being submitted. So what about corrective action plans that were submitted for previous evaluation cycles? CAP submitted for the 2018-2019 sponsor evaluation will be included in the review process by evaluators for the 2019-2020 review cycle for comparison purposes for applicable items. Generally, if a sponsor submits the same exact CAP for a school this year as they did last year for a specific compliance item, a sponsor may be determined to be not compliant for that item. Now let's take a look at the same compliance item with a different outcome. In this case, we have entered yes as the answer to the listed question, indicating that the school does have written policies and procedures regarding students with disabilities, and that the school ensures those services are provided to students as required by the law. The yes now affects two columns. The certification determination will indicate that the sponsor is compliant for that item and that documentation is required. In addition, both the certification determination and the required documentation cells will be highlighted in yellow. This feature assists sponsors and hopefully aids in completing the worksheet successfully. The highlighted required documentation cell lists the documentation that you must upload in the appropriate submission type in Epicenter. Now let's take a look at how the certification worksheet works if there are two compliance component questions associated with one item. We will use item 102 as an example. In this case, the first compliance component question will typically determine the applicability of the item for the sponsor or school. In this case, you will answer both questions. For this example, we have entered yes in both question and answer columns. The school is a party to an agreement for a joint education program. Therefore, the second component question is applicable. The school also indicates that it does not charge tuition or fees for student participation in those programs. The result in this example is a certification determination of sponsor certified compliant. As there is no required documentation for this item, there is no further action to take or documentation to upload to Epicenter. Now let's review the same item when different responses are supplied to the component questions. If the answer to question 1 is yes, but the answer to question 2 is no, then the result is sponsor certified not compliant. Again, as there is no documentation required, the sponsor must provide a narrative on the submission type in Epicenter. In addition, the sponsor must answer the corrective action plan question. If the school is placed on a corrective action plan, the associated plan must be uploaded to Epicenter. As stated earlier, the vendor will review the submitted corrective action plan, if applicable, and the sponsor will be considered compliant for the item if the plan sufficiently addresses the not compliant item. Now let's take one more look at one more possible result for item 102. If you answer no to the first question, there is no need to answer the second question, as you will see the question begins with if yes. If you enter a response for question 2, the certification determination will indicate do not answer question 2. In that case, simply delete the response for question 2, and the certification determination will display the appropriate response. In this case, the determination is sponsor certified not applicable. As with a not compliant determination, the sponsor must provide an appropriate narrative in Epicenter to satisfy the requirement if the item lists required documentation. Now let's discuss something else you will see within some of the compliance questions on the spreadsheet. Capitalized "and" is within some compliance component questions. We will call these questions compound questions. Compliance items that ask multiple questions within a singular component question is also referred to as a compound question. Using Oversight of Schools item 402 as an example, let's look at compliance component question 2, where you'll notice there are 2 questions and it features the uppercase "and." To get to compliance question 2, the sponsor has provided a yes response to compliance component question 1. This makes the item applicable, and a response to the second component question is required to generate the certification determination. The "and" indicates that there are 2 singular questions within the component question. In this case, the first question being asked is, did the attendance officer institute proceedings for violations of compulsory education laws? The second question is, did the attendance officer keep records? You must consider both questions to determine the appropriate answer for compliance component question 2, as you can only enter one response of either yes or no. A yes to the first part of the question and a yes response to the second portion of the question results in an overall question 2 response of yes. In this case, you would enter yes in the answer to question 2 cell. If the response is yes to both singular questions within the component question, then the certification determination is compliant for this item. If both responses to the question are no, then the overall response to the component question is no. And if either parts of the question have an answer of no, then the final response for that cell is no. Let's discuss something else you will see within some compliance component questions on the worksheets, uppercase "or." We talked about compound questions where the answers to both parts of the component question must be yes to be compliant. Now we will look at an example where there are different situations within a component question that determine compliance. Using item S605 as an example, you will see 2 questions with the capitalized "or" in the second compliance component question. If the response to the first question within the component question is yes, then the overall response to that specific component question is yes. If the response is no to both parts of the component question, then the overall response to the component question is no. This example concludes the review of certification determination for compliance items and how responses generate the determination within the worksheet. Now let's shift gears a bit and review evidence submission. The window for submission uploads will open in Epicenter sometime in December 2019 and will remain open until the submission window closes on June 30th, 2020. Sponsors will be notified when the submission window opens for the compliance component. For the compliance worksheets, items that indicate none in the required documentation column are certification-only items. There will be no submission in Epicenter for these items. Therefore, there is no additional action to take if the certification determination is compliant. For any item for which there is something listed in the required documentation column, the sponsor must upload documentation to Epicenter. If the certification determination is sponsor certified compliant, documentation required, the listed documentation must be uploaded to support the compliant determination. Failure to upload the required documentation will result in being found not compliant on the item. If the compliance determination is sponsor certified not compliant, there would be no documentation to submit. In this case, the sponsor must enter the narrative of not compliant in Epicenter to satisfy the submission and remove it from the sponsor's task queue. The same is done for any item that requires documentation and has a certification determination of sponsor certified not applicable. Simply make the notation not applicable. Sponsors will make one submission that includes all applicable corrective action plans for which the school was certified as not compliant. Please be sure to indicate in some way on the document which item or items to which it applies. When submitting the requested documentation, please be mindful of any confidential or personally identifiable information that may be contained in the documents. If something you plan to submit contains confidential or individual student information, please stop and contact the department for further assistance prior to uploading the documentation to Epicenter. If the vendor begins to review a submitted document that was incorrectly submitted containing visible confidential information, that document will be removed from the review process and will not be considered. Documents must be uploaded into Epicenter by the June 30th deadline to be considered for the sponsor evaluation. Sponsors will have until 11:59 p.m. on June 30th, 2020 to upload documentation to Epicenter. The requirements will be scheduled and the upload document window will open sometime in December 2019. However, the compliance requirements will not appear in a sponsor's task queue until 60 days before they are due. As a reminder, the department will notify sponsors when the submission window opens. Requirements will remain in the sponsor's task queue until they are satisfied in Epicenter by the sponsor. For compliance items that require documentation but are not applicable or are not compliant, sponsors will need to supply an appropriate narrative within the submission type in Epicenter to remove the item from their task queue. Required submission types will be listed in the sponsor's task queue. A submission type is the title given to a request for documentation within the department's online platform, Epicenter. Use the correct submission type for each compliance item. Sponsors can replace documents in Epicenter if needed until the document submission window closes. Once the window closes, documents cannot be added, replaced, or removed. Make sure that uploaded files can be opened and are easy to read. If a document is corrupt and is unable to be opened, you will be considered not compliant for that item. Lastly, use only the compliance worksheets as provided by the department, which are available on the department's website for the 2019-2020 sponsor evaluation tools. It is vital that all sponsors submit the completed worksheets as provided by the department, as these will be the files used by the vendors and the department for the review process. We appreciate all sponsors' cooperation in using the appropriate documents as provided. Should you experience any technical difficulties when uploading files, please reach out to your education program specialist, evaluation staff, or the Epicenter help desk. After completing the worksheets, a sponsor will be able to get a sense of their overall compliance. There is a certification form that is used to certify sponsor responses that is uploaded to Epicenter under the appropriate submission type. The certification form requires sign-off by an individual authorized to represent the sponsoring organization. Following the submission deadline, the vendor review process begins, where reviewers will evaluate compliance based on submitted worksheets, corrective action plans, validation, and on-site reviews. Now let's discuss compliance validation and on-site reviews. Validation was new for the 2018-2019 review cycle and was conducted simultaneously for some schools during on-site reviews. Other schools and sponsors underwent the validation process of the review by evaluators through a documentation review. Ohio Administrative Code 3301-102-08 permits the department to validate compliance items. Compliance items will be randomly selected for both sponsors and schools. It is possible for sponsors with multiple schools in their portfolio, different compliance items for validation will be chosen for each school. The pool of items for which validation may occur for 2019-2020 will be posted to the department's website on the 2019-2020 Sponsor Evaluation Tools website. Sponsors will be notified of the specific compliance items selected for validation prior to the actual on-site review, but after the on-site review is scheduled. Every school is evaluated for compliance and will factor into the final calculation. However, a minimum 10% of a sponsor's schools will be randomly selected by the third-party vendor for the on-site review. At least one of each school type, for example, site-based, e-schools, dropout prevention and recovery schools, will be randomly selected to be included in the sample. Sponsors and schools will be notified of which schools have been randomly selected for each on-site review. The vendor will review a defined number of items for validation during the on-site review. For selected items that require documentation from the sponsor, the validation process will consist of a comparison of documents supplied at the school with what was submitted by the sponsor in Epicenter, as well as ensuring the documentation provided at the on-site visit is compliant with statutory requirements. For selected certification-only items, the school may be requested to provide evidence of the certification determination. Sponsor representatives are permitted to attend the review as observers. However, school personnel are to provide the requested documentation and respond to questions. Both the schools and the validation items selected for each school will be published after the submission deadline. For items where validation will occur on-site, notification will occur after scheduling, but before the visit. Sponsor representatives are permitted to attend the review as observers. However, school personnel are to provide the requested documentation and to respond to questions. Next, we will discuss preliminary results in the adjustment review process. Ohio Revised Code 3314.016b requires the department to provide community school sponsors an opportunity to review preliminary results for two of the three components on which sponsors are evaluated: the quality practices component, in compliance with all applicable laws and rules. State law also allows sponsors to request an adjustment of their ratings on one or both components based on previously submitted documentation if the sponsor feels that the rating is in error. To facilitate this process, the department makes the preliminary review results for each quality practices standard and each compliance item available to sponsors in late September, early October by providing access to the information submitted by the review vendors through Epicenter. There are multiple files associated with the compliance component review. The following completed worksheets can be found by searching for the preliminary compliance results in Epicenter. There are two submission types, one for the sponsor file and one for the Oversight of Schools files. The available files are listed below. The files are all similar in structure. They consist of the files submitted by the sponsor with 3 additional columns added to the far right that contain the review results, which we discussed a few minutes ago. The preliminary rating spreadsheets can be used to calculate an overall preliminary rating for the compliance component of the evaluation. Department staff will notify sponsors of deadlines in advance. Sponsors that wish to request an adjustment will will have 10 business days from the publication of the preliminary ratings to request the adjustment review. To request a review, sponsors must complete the Sponsor Adjustment Request Form. The form is an Excel spreadsheet that contains 3 tabs, one for sponsor quality, one for sponsor compliance, and one for schools compliance. Instructions for each tab are found below in the appropriate section. Sponsors must submit the completed Sponsor Adjustment Request Form through Epicenter. Department staff will review each request and make a recommendation for each listed item and/or standard. Recommendations are then considered by a second-level review team to arrive at a final rating. The department will use the final rating for each item and/or standard when calculating the final component rating and overall sponsor rating. Additional details about the adjustment review process is included in the 2019-2020 Sponsor Evaluation Overview Training and will be communicated to sponsors. Now let's move on to our next section of the compliance training, calculating the compliance score and publishing the final results. For the 2019-2020 evaluation, there are 3 columns used by the vendor for each compliance item on the scoring spreadsheets. The spreadsheet submitted by the sponsor will be expanded to include these columns. The first column is the reviewer response to initial score. This indicates if the vendor agrees with the sponsor's compliance determination. The second column is the final reviewer rating. This column contains vendor's compliance determination for each item. It will either be compliant, not compliant, or not applicable. The third column is the justification. This column contains the explanation for the vendor compliance determination, which is picked from a standardized list. As previously noted, as the sponsor's submitted worksheets are used by the evaluators for data entry and documentation verification. If the sponsor alters the provided spreadsheets, they risk losing data evaluated and may be determined not compliant for items. The vendor determinations, as well as the results of any adjustment request, if applicable for both sponsor and school-level items, are used to calculate the final compliance score. The sponsor's score for the compliance component is determined by equally weighting 22 of the 23 sponsor-level items and weighting sponsor-level item S615 up to 4 points. This item specifically addresses a sponsor's oversight of all of its schools. All schools factor into the amount of points a sponsor receives at the sponsor level for item S615. The percentage of sponsor-level compliant items will yield the sponsor's overall compliance rating. Let's explore sponsor-level item S615 further and review sponsor-level and school-level scoring changes more closely. Item S615 incorporates the 280 school-level items for all sponsored schools to demonstrate sponsor oversight of schools. To assess this item, the third-party vendor reviews all submitted documentation for each school in the sponsor's portfolio. For item S615, a sponsor receives a score of 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 points. The points received by a sponsor for this item depends on its percentage of substantiated compliance items. All schools count in the evaluation score for the 2019-2020 review cycle, not just the minimum 10% random sample selected for on-site reviews. The school-level percentage of substantiated items determine the points a sponsor receives for item S615 at the sponsor level. This slide shows how the overall compliance rating is determined. The rating categories are exceeds expectations, meets expectations, progressing toward expectations, below expectations, and significantly below expectation. In accordance with state law, the sponsor evaluation ratings must be available annually online on the department's website by November 15, 2020. Copies of a sponsor's overall rating are emailed individually to each sponsor, and the details of each rating will be available in Epicenter. This concludes our training and review of the compliance component of the sponsor evaluation for the 2019-2020 review cycle. The department will continue to update the FAQs and post them online soon on the 2019-2020 Evaluation Tools website. As always, should you have any questions, comments, concerns, or experience technical difficulties during the sponsor evaluation review process, please reach out to the department staff or contact us via email